Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Patrick Bell, and I'm a partner here at Shepherd and Wedderburn. We're really delighted to be able to host you all for this Forgotten Wisdom event. My role is a very simple one, which is literally to do that, to welcome you. A couple of very short admin points. The first one is that there is no fire drill planned. So regrettably, if the fire alarm does go off, we are going to have to exit. There's fire exits that way and actually back by the lifts the way you came in. Talking of the lifts, that is the direction you must follow if you need to use the restrooms. I am glad that the weather has lifted a wee bit, because about an hour and a half ago you couldn't see the magnificent view that we had behind you, but the weather gods have shined on us, so that's pleasing. So, however, your attention is going to be much more focused in this direction, I think, this evening. So without further ado, I will hand you over to Ellie, who is going to host us this evening.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you everyone for coming this evening. One other piece of housekeeping, this evening is being live streamed, so welcome to everyone watching online at the moment. And as Patrick said, my name's Ellie, and I'm really pleased to be here this evening on behalf of Women in Public Affairs Scotland, so otherwise known as WIPA. And for those of you who don't know, we're an organisation that aims to connect and support women working in Scotland's policy and public affairs sectors. And we have 3 WIPA committee members at the front, so if you have any questions, please come and ask them afterwards. So one of the strengths of WIPA is that we have a really diverse membership. So we have women who are really seasoned public affairs professionals, and we also have members who are starting out in their public and policy careers. And I wondered to what extent we have a similar range of expertise and knowledge in the room. So a really quick bit of audience participation, and I promise it's not too painful. I'd like to see a show of hands if you consider yourself to be, and you'll have to excuse the phrase, if you consider yourself to be a bit of an old hand in all of this, if you've been around the constitutional block a few times. And I'd hope the panelists would put their hand up at that. Okay, so quite a few. And on the other end of the spectrum, a show of hands if the Scottish Constitutional Convention and the referendum in 1997 are a little bit unfamiliar, perhaps because you were a child, perhaps because you weren't yet born in 1997. So a few shyer hands. But I think that tells us that we've got a really good range of perspectives in the room, and that's exactly what we want to dig into today. So, as I said, very much on the side of experience. We have 3 fantastic panelists here to share their wisdom. And we will first hear from Stephen Noon, who's worked at senior levels in government, parliament, and across Scottish politics more broadly. And Stephen is currently a PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh, and we'll hear about his research and focus on devolution's promise of delivering a new politics. I'm then going to invite Esther Roberton to share her recollections as co-ordinator of the Scottish Constitutional Convention. And we'll then hear from Sir John Elvidge, who served as permanent secretary to the Scottish Government from 2003 until 2010. And I could have said a lot more about our 3 panelists. Their biographies are long and impressive, and if I were to cover it all, we'd simply run out of time. So, we want to keep this evening fairly relaxed, fairly informal. And so once our panelists have warmed up and we've gotten a bit of debate going, I don't think that's going to be difficult, we will open up to questions, thoughts, and reflections from the floor. Because as I said before, we've got a range of perspectives, a range of expertise, and that's what we want to hear today. So, Stephen, may I hand over to you?
Well, hello everybody, thank you for coming. I should say that this project emerged in conversation with Susan, who's at the back there. We were having coffee and she was asking about how my PhD research was going, and I was saying that there were gems emerging, essentially, things which I think people may have forgotten from the time when the Parliament was first being discussed and then created. So what I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about some of the initial thoughts I have, having just completed 30 interviews with people who were deeply involved in the devolution project, the creation, and in the early years of the Parliament, and then opening up for conversation with my colleagues here, but also with you, many of whom were actively involved in the creation of the devolution project. So my PhD is basically looking at the idea of new politics. Many of you will remember when the Parliament was set up, there was a promise of a new culture of politics. And what I'm trying to do is understand what does that actually mean, what was meant at the time, and to what extent has it actually been delivered on. So what I've done is I've interviewed, as I said, 30 people from politics, academia, civil service, special advisors, the full range, journalists, people who've been involved in the scene. And what I'm trying to do is gathering that evidence and then trying to see patterns within it, intelligibilities within it. And so tonight is basically me having a first stab at some first intelligibilities. And part of your role this evening is to interrogate those, challenge, ask questions, help me to maybe deepen my understanding, so that when the project develops, I will have thought these things through fully. So the question that's been in my mind is, what's actually different in new politics that isn't simply old politics at its best? Politics is politics, deals get done, arrangements have to be made. So what's actually new in the new politics? What's different in the new politics? So I'm going to present you with three ideas. The first one is Leviathan versus Covenant. So the idea of Leviathan, many of you will recognize from English, British, political philosophy, the idea that we are a series of individuals, a series of atoms, and in order for us to be pointing in the right direction, we need a powerful central sovereign parliament, the sovereignty of parliament. And at the time of the debate, when the parliament was being created, there was a very detailed debate about the difference between this principle, Leviathan, Parliament as a mortal god, as somebody described it, absolute power in the land, and what we wanted the Scottish Parliament to be, which was something different, something which was not seeing individuals as a starting point, but seeing relationships and connections as a starting point. And so the idea of covenant, or communion, or society, however you may want to phrase it. But there was a very sharp difference at the beginning between these two senses of what parliamentary government could be. And for me, the devolution project chose very actively the second, the covenant, the relationship, the partnership. Many of you will have heard of the Consultative Steering Group. It was the body which was designed to create the standing orders, etc., of the Parliament. And they set forward certain principles for the Parliament and its behaviour, one of which was power sharing. And the idea being that the government would share power with the Parliament. There'd be the ability for the Parliament to properly scrutinise through things like its committees. But if you look at the Constitutional Convention, they took the idea of power sharing further. And it was power sharing between the centre and the localities. I look at some of the words used in the final convention report, and it talks about local government as being there to prevent concentration of power, non-confrontational, not removing powers, the centre not removing powers from local government, central and local government cooperating, working closely together, common approach and partnership. So there was something really powerful at the beginning about the idea of the Parliament not being like the Westminster Parliament and sitting above all the other institutions in Scotland, but being nestled within, sharing power, recognising the authority of all the different elements. And that's a principle which, Esther's probably going to talk about this in more detail, but that for me was a very important part of the conversation. We chose covenant and not Leviathan. We didn't want a mini Westminster at Holyrood. We wanted something different. So that's reflection one, and we can talk about the extent to which that's been delivered. The second principle, or the second point, would be the difference between access and participation. So in the steering group's principles, they had as one of the principles access and participation. And what's been interesting from the conversations, the interviews, is that some people emphasised the access, which is about people having the ability to go into Parliament and see the debates and give their evidence to committees. And then there was another group who were very much focused on the idea of participation, and participation being something much different from just simply having access to the Parliament. So participation being, in some respects, in a strong version of it, being about co-creation, real partnership, decisions being taken not just simply in one place, but being taken, again, in this idea of collectively. And I suppose the thought I have is that Civic Scotland played such a central role in the creation of the Parliament. So there were elements of the process of the creation of the Parliament which only the politicians could do. There had to be legislation, there had to be electoral victory, but there were certain things that only Civic Scotland could do. And Civic Scotland created a space within which the politics could be done. And for many people, the expectation was that that same experience of Civic Scotland supporting, nurturing the political process would be carried on in some way into the Parliament. And some of you remember that at the beginning there was a thing called the Civic Forum set up, which I think was trying to capture some of this. Some of my interviews spoke about, perhaps jokingly, that people were talking about it as being a civic senate. And I think that conveys something of what was hoped for. This, not a revising body, but an advisory group, the wisdom of Civic Scotland in some way able to support the work of the emerging Parliament. But of course, after a couple of years, the Civic Forum disappeared, and perhaps the institutions as they were when the Parliament arrived are still pretty much as they were. So we have local government pretty much as it was. We have the Quango structure pretty much as it was. We have the institutions of Civic Scotland pretty much as they were. And the image I have in my mind is almost like if you imagine the old Scotland office being this tiny head on the body politics of Scotland, that was taken off. The Parliament was put on with a new head. But what's happened to the body? Is the head connected to the body in the way that it was meant to be? Has the head transformed the body in the way that it was meant to be? And I think that does say, if you're just about access, all Civic Scotland, all the stakeholders have to do is turn up and give their evidence. If you're talking about participation, it's something deeper and much more substantial in terms of the partnership. So as a final thought, and maybe I'm talking too much, I promised you I wouldn't talk too much in this starting point. So a third point, I've talked a wee bit about philosophy, a wee bit about language. What struck me as I was doing the interviews was people, when they were speaking about their experience of the Parliament, very often spoke in emotional terms about the experience of the opening of the Parliament in particular. And it struck me again when I was speaking to people who were involved in the convention, there was something quite deep and emotional about the bonds that were built through the process of the convention. Bonds which were then built also through the process of the referendum. So it's almost like a widening circle of participation. You had Labour and the Liberal Democrats at the beginning, supported by Civic Scotland in the convention. You had the SNP able to join in the referendum. And you had the Conservatives able to join when the Parliament was set up. And people from all these different parties would speak with a huge power of emotion about what the Parliament and its project meant for them and how they had been embraced by the project. The contrast was with when I was speaking to people out there about the experience after the referendum, the 2014 referendum. And instead of having one shared emotional touch point, people had two very different emotional touch points. So for those who were on the yes side of the campaign, there was the joy and the empowerment. For those who were on the no side of the campaign, there was the anxiety, the threat, the fear, being an awful experience. And it strikes me as being quite important that we have moved from a place where our politicians had a shared horizon, a shared emotional space, a connection to a project which united them beyond the politics, the sort of individual politics. And we're now in a space where our politicians are rooted in two very different emotional spaces. So I think the challenge for us as Civic Scotland is to find a way to help the politicians again reconnect into that shared horizon, that shared space. So what is the difference between old politics and new politics? I think it is something about a different way of sharing power within the country. I think it's something about a different way of participating in governance. And I also think it's something about a shared horizon, an emotional connection, a belief in the project, which means that people are willing to then compromise and engage and do their old politics, but in a better way.
Stephen, thank you. That was great. And I'm going to just move on. We'll keep this sort of scene setting going and invite Esther to share her experience and her reflections on the points that Stephen's made.
Thanks, Ellie. It's an interesting place to start when you did the bit at the very beginning, because Hamza Yusuf, when he was First Minister, said something, and I remember getting quite cross about it. And then somebody said, you do realise he was 12 years old when the Parliament was established. And that really shook me to the core, because coming back to Stephen's point, as he described that emotional connection, it takes me back to being in the chamber the day the Parliament first met. There are all sorts of stories in the room, and then again the day of the opening. To declare an interest, I was the coordinator of the convention. I then went on to be involved in setting up Scotland Forward, which was the kind of umbrella referendum campaign that brought the SNP to the table, and then was one of the CSG that wrote those principles. And I think it's really interesting that Stephen should pick up the power sharing point, because of course that point in the principles actually says government will share power with the Parliament and Parliament will share power with the people. And it was interesting, we said people, not councils or whatever. And there is a question about how far we've gone with that. I'm also smiling about your participation point, because I normally describe this and I can recite half of the principle, because it says a participative approach to the development, consideration and scrutiny of policy and legislation. And my usual point is that that policy word was inserted late on by Henry McLeish, because his view, which has turned out to be an interesting situation, was that government can do a lot without legislating. You might not think that given the kind of programme of legislation. The point I'd like to make today, though, and I see Susan Deacon in the audience, no doubt smiling, because Susan was the first person that told me the pig and chicken joke and said to me there's a difference between participation and engagement. And it took me a long time to remember the joke, and if you want to hear it afterwards, it's fine. But it is about, you know, the pig says to the chicken, it's all very well for you, you're participating, I'm involved. We'll get to the point of the joke. But I think we haven't even achieved the participative approach that we might have hoped for, far less the engagement, and I'll come back to that. The new politics we all hoped for. The convention, admittedly, in some ways didn't have a challenge because the SNP and the Conservatives weren't at the table. But even then, with trade unions, churches, women's groups, civic organisations, we had at least 4 parties, I meant to check, Labour, Lib Dem, Democratic Left and Green, for sure. Oh, and Co-op, so it was a Co-op party. People think consensus is easy and cosy, and it's nothing of the kind. I shared a platform last week with Jack McConnell, and I teased him about his hair is white because of the work he had to do behind the scenes with Andy Miles of the Lib Dems and others, with folk like Campbell Christie of the SDUC holding their feet to the fire on some of the really controversial issues. The significance was an absolute unity of purpose. The convention had only one job, and that was to agree a scheme for a parliament. And nobody got everything they wanted, but most people got at least some, and I would suspect quite a lot of what they hoped for out of the scheme. It didn't all make it into the Scotland Act, and I'll briefly come to that, but that made consensus perhaps a little easier. But the bottom line in the end is those negotiations were often hard and thorny, but they were always civilised, respectful, and in a way, the kind of culture we all hoped the Parliament would have. And sadly, over the 25 years, that has deteriorated. I can't now remember if we felt it was like that to begin with, but certainly it's not now. It's become a bit of a bear pit, much like Westminster, which is a real disappointment to me. And I was heartened when John Swinney became First Minister that he put his hand up and admitted he was as guilty as anybody and that he would try to do better. So I think that clarity of purpose is really critical. And for me, the frustration is I don't believe any politician gets elected to that Parliament without the commitment to Scotland. Whatever they believe about the constitutional issue, they want to build a better Scotland. And frankly, I might say nobody would volunteer to be an MSP for the good of it because it's a pretty challenging role. Pretty high profile, and as others in this room will know, pretty tough going for many of them. What the convention had, which the Parliament needs to rediscover, is ambition and commitment and courage to that vision of a better Scotland. And I have all sorts of views about what we might do in the next 25 years. But coming back to the 3 points that Stephen raised, and I did worry when you said Leviathan and Covenant. I thought, I'm going to have to go get my dictionary out. But you're absolutely right. And back to the emotion, I was a geek all the way through. I joined the campaign for a Scottish Assembly in 1979. I followed all the work up to the establishment of the convention, and I skived off to be in the Assembly Hall the day it was launched. And to hear Kenyon Wright, sadly no longer with us, when he said, what will we do if that voice we know and love so well says no? Well, and we are the state, that was his line. And his answer was, we will say yes because we are the people. And Kenyon's absolute fundamental was always the sovereignty of the people. And I think that is important. But if we really believed that, then that power sharing would be much more effective. And I've begun to wonder if 25 years on, I jokingly say the Parliament is the same age as my younger son, and he's only really just grown up. Was it inevitable that a new Parliament would suck powers to itself? Because every presentation I did to little groups up in Thurso, to 200 people in the EICC, I was always asked the question, won't the Parliament just suck up powers from local government? And with absolute conviction, I said every time, no, of course not. It has signed up for all these principles. How wrong was I? 25 years on, powers have been drawn to the centre, both financial powers and others, and local councils are now seen virtually as nothing more than a delivery arm of Scottish Government, and that was never the intention. If you read the convention scheme, and I've been revisiting the 2 pages, it's very clear about re-empowering local government, addressing local government finance to bring them into line with European norms, and to address the quango state. And as someone, if you went far enough back, who's been described as a quango queen, you might find it a bit odd. But the quangos were established to address a democratic deficit. Once we had the Parliament, the belief was we would address that and that we would get into looking at what could be devolved locally and be more democratically controlled. And we may get into that discussion later. So I believe absolutely we took the Covenant approach, and I think we're closer to that than the Leviathan, but I don't think we've nearly shared enough power. Participation, I think the Parliament participation team, for example, does some great work, but the committees have not had the time, the opportunity to do the kind of work that we thought they would do in that participation. And it was interesting you mentioned the Civic Forum, because Anne Packard and I were at a meeting this afternoon with Eileen Francis, who was one of the founder members, and we were saying maybe it was just not the right time. And there is a view that says Civic Scotland, once we had the Parliament, almost just sat back and said, well, that's job done, we'll let them get on with it. But also, to be fair, if I look at the STUC as an example, they campaigned long and hard to get the Parliament, never realising the impact it would have on their workload. Suddenly they were being consulted about everything. And that's not their main job. Their main job is looking after their members. So maybe Civic Scotland didn't have the capacity, but we need to get back to that. And as far as the emotional response is concerned, I think you can probably tell. It doesn't take much for me to be choking up about the pride I felt that day. And I just need to hear Sheena Wellington singing in the Parliament and the Queen and Prince Philip looking at their feet, which was an interesting experience, as she did the bit about the Birkie Ca Lord. We've done well. I'm very happy we've got it. I think there's a lot to be done and a lot of scope to do much more, regardless of what happens with our constitutional future. And we need to get back to some of those basic principles, and we'll maybe talk about that later. Hope that wasn't too long, Ellie.
No, not at all. And Quango Queen was not in your biography, so thank you for
no,
sharing
I don't
that.
often own up to that, but you don't have to look very far for the headline.
And John, last but not least, it would be great to hear your response to Stephen's scene setting.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everybody. It might not seem like a response at first, but I will loop back there a bit. I want to make sure we don't lose the wisdom from what was achieved in the beginning, and that we don't fail to give the politicians who were grappling with the early period of devolution the credit they deserve for the things that they achieved. In the first 12 years of devolution, we had two coalitions, and I invite you to contemplate the panicked state of Westminster and Whitehall at having to have a coalition government in 2010 before you conclude that it isn't a difficult thing to do, to be the first post-war coalition in the UK. And then we had a minority government, the conventional wisdom of which is unstable and unachievable. And as far as I've been able to establish, there is no example, historically or internationally, anywhere of a government sustaining minority government for 4 years and delivering the majority of what it set out to deliver. All of the credit for that rests with the politicians who were leading us through those demanding changes in political structures. Doing what people haven't done before is not easy. I mentioned delivery in the minority government. It's become conventional for us all to bemoan delivery as an inevitable consequence of devolution, as a state we're troubled by. At the end of the second coalition, I commissioned an audit of the performance of that government against the promises it had made in its programme for government, that showed that well over 90% of the things that it had promised to do had been done. That seems to me a fair picture of delivery. And in 2007, the incoming minority government created Scotland Performs, which was a real-time update on progress against the commitments that it had made in the National Performance Framework. And if you took a snapshot in 2011, you would have seen that in that very simple system of judging performance, green arrows pointing up, red arrows pointing down, amber arrows pointing sideways, there were more green arrows than there were red arrows. So our politicians over that period led us towards a track record of delivery. You can argue about whether the things delivered were always the right things. That's an entirely different question. But the basic principle of the democratic contract between governments and the people is: we say we'll do this, we do this, and therefore that's what it's fair to judge them by. And I want to go back to two things about 2007 2008, we've talked about the importance of common purpose as an absolute guiding principle of all of the thinking that went on. And my one visual aid is the National Performance Framework. I only carry it as laminated because it's accompanied me on many international trips, talking to governments in other countries, most of whom said they wished they could have something of the same kind, because you will struggle to find any equivalent of this written statement of national purpose in other countries. It aspired to be a statement of national purpose. It has all-party support, and it has endured, which for me is one of the critical tests of changes made in government. It is still the accepted statement of common purpose endorsed by all of the political parties in Scotland. We may have lost sight of how to use that, but that's a different question. And I also wanted to come back to the concept of concordat, because one of the changes that accompanied this about 9 months later, was a concordat between government and local government designed to restore freedoms to local government, to reduce the financial constraints that required them to spend particular sums of money in particular ways, and give them more scope to use local discretion. Again, we might have drifted, but the intention was very squarely there, and John Swinney was absolutely heart and centre of that attempt to do the rebalancing. So, alongside the entirely legitimate criticisms of the gap between the aspirations and the way it's played out, I think it's important that we acknowledge that there's a mixed picture here. And as Esther said, no politician goes into this without wanting to see a better Scotland as a result. And similarly, I think no politician goes into this without a desire to move towards the kind of politics that the Constitutional Convention aspired to, however difficult it's proving to get there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Before we move to questions from the floor, Stephen, Esther, John, just wanted to give you an opportunity to give your thoughts, if anything sparked a bit of a response there, hearing each other speak.
So, I don't believe in black and whites, and I think the reality is that the picture is quite nuanced. I think it's very important to emphasise that a lot has been achieved. In terms of the new politics, the four principles that the CSG spoke about were power sharing, participation, accessibility, equal opportunity, and accountability. And if you think about the degree to which the gender balance of the Parliament, the diversity of the Parliament in comparison with the 72 MPs that used to be sent to Westminster, who were, they were almost like cut out of the same block. Accountability, again, the difference between what it was in the 1990s, where you would have Scottish questions once a month, and you would have a taxi load of Tories, as somebody described it to me, governing the country, and Parliament being somewhere else. And so in terms of equal opportunity and in terms of accountability, there have been substantial steps forward in the Parliament. But I think the 25th anniversary is a great opportunity to actually just reflect back at what it was we hoped for. Again, I'm not somebody who sort of says there's people to blame or we did something wrong. I think sometimes we just find ourselves drifting into spaces that when we actually realise we're there, we don't want to be where we are. So this isn't a harsh criticism of the Parliament, but it's meant to be recognising where we are now, recognising that it's probably not ideal. What can we do to shift ourselves back into the broad direction of travel, which was the mainstream and the anticipation when the Parliament was set up. So that would be my reflection.
And I think we did a debate last week, and there is a danger that when you're asked, what you focus on is all that went wrong or that didn't quite work out. But somebody, it was Ken McIntosh, actually, the former presiding officer, in a session reminded me of something I had completely forgotten. And I had to explain this to my children, my sons, because they had no idea what it was. You know, we forget that one of the early acts of the Scottish Parliament was to abolish poindings and warrant sales. And there'll be people in this room who will wonder what on earth they are. They were an absolutely barbaric practice when people got into debt of having their possessions put out on the pavement and sold under their noses, often for peanuts. So there was a really interesting example of something that was hugely powerful and we'd forgotten. But we've done all sorts of things, including PR for local government, the smoking ban, alcohol pricing, the rights of the child, all sorts of stuff that's really, really positive. And you're absolutely right. I've spoken to people who are so envious of that statement. And they have done a huge amount. I'm absolutely taken aback that you got 90%. That's astonishing. So I do think that, and on the new politics culture, the other thing I often say is, this is partly the Parliament. If you go back to the CSG report, and one of these days I'll get an online version and I'll do one of these clever checks, but I'm pretty certain that nowhere in that report will you find the word whip, because we didn't think we'd need whips. We'd have business managers, but it was going to be consensus, and people would be working together so they wouldn't be whipped by their party. Well, neither did we use the word opposition party, because we didn't think there would be an official opposition. But Alex Salmond was very clever and realised that the model meant that if it became the official opposition, lots of money came to fund an office and all the rest. But actually, the coarseness of the discourse is a reflection of what's gone on in society, and I don't just mean in Scotland. We see it across the UK and further afield. So in a way, it's a bit much to expect our Parliament to behave differently when things are the way they are. But a very senior politician, not in government, said to me recently, I'm as guilty as all the rest. And one day I was in the chamber groaning about the quality of the debate. And I looked up to the public gallery and it was full of school pupils. And I just thought, what example are we setting to that generation? The ones that were complaining about being violent in schools and all the rest, see people in the Parliament name-calling and abusing each other, black as white, just for the sake of argument. And I think there's a growing awareness amongst the politicians that accessibility and that visibility means they need to get back to setting an example and showing, to pinch another phrase, how we can disagree agreeably, because that's what we need to be doing. That disagreement's important, but it can be done civilly.
John, did you want to come in with anything else before we go to questions?
Just one reflection that I didn't touch on, which is we've been talking so far about the dialogue within Scotland and the relationships within Scotland, and really all of this was part of, well, it was certainly part of a two-way relationship with the UK government and remains so. But at the moment of devolution, it felt more like a triangle of those two plus the people who'd done government and of whom the ask was, instead of being like that, be like this. And they hadn't been in the dialogue. And so it was inevitable, I think, that the presence of three voices in those early years would produce some tensions, some friction. And it's just a reality that we need to acknowledge.
You're being very polite using words like tension and friction. It's very restrained.
I'm a civil servant. I'm trained to use those words.
He's absolutely right, though, because one of the comments at the time was how many people from Westminster would stand, and the assumption was it would be a bad thing. They were abandoning Westminster. But actually, we knew we needed some to have some experience. But they did bring, Donald Dewar himself brought some awful Westminster practices with him. We then had people that had never been politicians before, and some of whom had no idea about the convention and the CSG. And once they were in Parliament, there's no way they were going to read the CSG report and understand what lay behind it. So I think you're absolutely right. There was that kind of tension. And the other was, it'll be local government writ large. And we had some very powerful ex-local government figures who were used to doing business in a particular way. I'll name no names in that instance. So I think tensions is a good word, John. Tensions.
You've been euphemistic again, Esther. I'm looking to Susan, and I'm going to hand the microphone over to her shortly because we want to take as many questions from the audience as possible. So I hope you've been thinking about your views around the Leviathan versus Covenant approach, issues around access and participation, and that third point that Stephen raised around that kind of shared emotional horizon, perhaps moving to existing in separate emotional spaces. We've also had comments about the role of Civic Scotland and the relationship between Parliament and local government. So plenty in there, and I will hand the microphone over to Susan, but hands up, and when Susan comes to you, it'd be great if you could introduce yourself.
Hello, Eva Grunewald. I'm a trustee at the DHI. Eva Grunewald, I'm a trustee at the DHI, also a civil servant. I think what everybody wants to know in the room is what did Humza Yousaf do that made Esther Roberton so angry? But I will get to a question as well. I guess your point about Humza Yousaf only being 11 or 15 years old when a lot of this debate happened is a really good one to contemplate, because our lived experience of these conversations and these debates is waning. It was 25 years ago. Our politicians are younger, and young people of today engage in civic life and political life in a very, very different way. Many young people would see new politics in an incredibly different way. They may look at the US and think that's the example to follow, or other countries. I think politics is in trouble nowadays, and I have a fear that a new politics just isn't possible. And I guess it goes back to the title of the event: is can we learn? How do we learn when our lived experience is waning over time?
He said, and it's not a criticism, it's just a fact, he said that the SNP had secured the Parliament and won the referendum. And of course they were dragged to the referendum table fairly reluctantly, to put it mildly. But I did forgive him, it's fine. I just thought, how could you possibly think that? And then looked up his page and discovered how young he was. So that's that. In terms of your wider point, Eva, I think you're absolutely right. One of the things that's come to me after last week's Festival of Politics is we need to stop calling it that. We need to call it a Festival of Democracy. Because the thing that scares me the most is when I hear academics tell me that the research is saying young people are so disengaged, they're beginning to think that a strong leader might be the answer. And how anybody can look across the Atlantic and think that would be the answer terrifies me. But it does bring me right back. Democracy in Scotland, we are one of the most, if not the most, centralised countries in Europe. I live in a town of 12,000 people. I discovered in a book recently, I come from Fife. Fife used to have 85 councils. We now have one. There is no country in Europe that would have one council running a place of 350,000 people. And immediately people throw their hands up in horror and say, we don't want more councils, we don't want more councillors. Well, in fact, our councils an individual council, a council covers about 170,000 people. In most European countries, it's 10,000. And councillors are part-time, and they're based in their communities, and people know who they are. And there is then scope for genuine local democracy. And I think the way we'll rebuild is to start from the local and build up. And interestingly, a group of former chief execs have done a submission to the local government committee, and they sent me a copy. And back to age, I was too young to remember this. I did not know that the Wheatley Commission, which established the regions and districts in the 70s, said that the answer was hyper-local. And yet we got local councils, district councils and regions, and we've now got 32 most of them very big, not all of them. And that hyper-local to me is where the answer lies. Give people a sense of agency and ownership and power in their own communities and build up from there, and we'll start to restore faith in democracy, I think.
So I've spoken about half my project really. So the first part of the project is the new politics, understanding what Scotland's new politics was all about. But the reason I'm looking at new politics is because when I was studying in North America, I came across a conversation about how do you deal with President Trump, the politics of fear, the politics of threat. And the conversation was you respond by having a politics of love. So what is a politics of love? Part of my thesis is I believe there are elements within Scotland's new politics which can tell us something about what a politics of love might be. So yeah, new politics is something from 25 years ago, but there's a need for a different approach to politics just now. And it is something where, so the phrase that's in my mind around a politics of love is the idea of interpersonal commitment. So that to have interpersonal commitment, you've got to have the relationship, you've got to have the smallness of the relationship building up. You've got to have the capacity for sacrifice. It's not just my interest. I'm not the atom, the individual. I'm part of something bigger than myself. It's the relationships are more important than the individuality. Both are important, but relationship is the starting point. And there's a purpose to it. So we do this because we want to transform the country. There's a creativity, a life giving in a politics of love. So for me, there's an absolute need to counter politics of fear and politics of threat. And the way to do it is, a politics of hope, yes, but it's a politics of relationship, community, sacrifice.
John, any thoughts on that idea of politics of love or the hyper-local approach?
Yeah, if I can be permitted a kind of a plug, my thoughts about all this are extensively rehearsed in the writings on the enabling state, which I did for the Carnegie UK Trust. One of the points about that is that, as Esther said, that is a bottom-up view of the right relationship between citizens and the state. But one of the underlying things is that love is not something that the state is inherently designed to be good at. The state is fundamentally about equity and the usual core purposes of the law and order and the defence of the nation and that kind of thing. But and that's why the state. One of the reasons why the state is better in an enabling role than it is in a directing role when it comes to the substance of people's everyday lives, and where you might build a positive relationship that would restore faith if people had that conception of the state as something that was there to assist them in their lives. I also wanted to pick up the point about local government. I just wanted to remind us that some of Europe's most successful, geographical locations will do. Finland and Catalonia. I can't remember which of them has 1,000 local authorities for a population of less than 10 million, and the other of them has 2,000 local authorities for a population not much greater. Our conception, I think we've slightly lost sight of the value of international comparisons when we think about Scotland, to pick up the point about where do we find the learning. And I also think that our boundaries of conceptions of the possible could do with a bit of stretching.
Just a bit. I always use Norway, and that was my point about councillors. Norway's got a similar population to ours. We have 1,200 councillors and they have 12,000. And you say that to people and they throw their hands up in horror at the notion of all that lot of extra councillors. But in Norway, they do it part-time alongside their jobs, their volunteers and the like. So I think that's astonishing. And I used to use that in my convention days. And the other is Highland Region, Highland Council is the geography of Belgium. And you've got councillors travelling those distances to a central council office in Inverness. And you wonder why the people feel so remote from democracy. So yeah, you're absolutely right.
We've got our next question lined up.
Well, I'm going to make an observation first. One wisdom I learnt from the early days of devolution when we did the book Instant Portraits was that of the 129, only 3 had ever held a board position on an arts, cultural, heritage organisation. So they were ignorant in that sphere. And only 3 had worked in the National Health Service, which is a big budget area. So whilst there'd been consumers, there'd never been employers or really employees. But my question is one which I put to Esther in the Parliament, and I refrained from asking at the meeting I convened today. Learning from the early days, the question of the cross-party groups, because you said, if I heard you correctly on Friday, that they hadn't really been envisaged in the manner in which they emerged, to which my supplementary was, and are there too many of them? And to Stephen, I would say, did that come out in any of the interviews you did? And, for example, John McCormick, when he did his review of the Parliament, whether that came out then, because there are now such a plethora of cross-party groups. Sarah Boyack told me on Friday evening she's involved with 17, which almost borders on farce. So, observations.
We have a problem where we have more CPGs than we do local authorities.
I suspect we've got more CPGs than we've got politicians in the Parliament, if I'm not mistaken.
Just about.
I think it's 160 or something. And just to challenge Anne there, of course, Sarah's not involved in 17. As most of them will admit, their names are on 17. They cannot possibly be properly involved. So my answer was there are far too many, but I don't know how you undo that when civic society values that opportunity so much.
So there was nobody spoke about them in the interviews, but in one of the early debates in the Parliament, when they were discussing the civic forum, the cross-party groups were seen as being in the same space as a civic forum. And for the government minister, he described them as being a useful way of dialoguing with civic society in Scotland. So that was certainly the initial desire from them. These were ways of MSPs being better connected into civic society, but the question would be whether they have served that purpose.
The question is, they may be connected, but are they informed and engaged, which is different?
I think the answer is no.
Okay, we've got Susan's passed the mic on to our next question.
So we've got 2 next to each other, so should we take them both together?
Yes.
Hello, thank you so much for all this. I've only been in Scotland 8 years, although I have read a bit about the earlier processes. But can I ask those of you, I mean, maybe particularly Esther, but maybe the rest of you, about the early decision making? Do you feel there are some fundamental flaws in the decisions that led up to the inauguration of the Parliament in terms of the settlement with Westminster, for example, around the budgetary processes? And we're seeing these huge problems that are coming out now that from today's announcement from the Scottish Fiscal Commission about the massive problems that the Scottish Government faces with in-year budgetary changes as a result of change in decision-making at Westminster. Secondly, about the whole question of the fact the Sewell Convention was only ever a convention and it's been overridden so much. And thirdly, I do recall that, of course, at the time the Parliament came into being, there was a whole process expected to follow in terms of devolution in England, which hasn't happened. And I wonder if you'd like to reflect on those 3 things.
Oh. That's okay, thank you. Gosh, I was on the
the General Assembly Hall of the Church of Scotland on the day that Scotland's Parliament, Scotland's Right was launched, and I've still got it. I've had many opportunities to throw it out, but I still can't bring myself to do it because of the emotional attachment that you talked about. I just want to draw a contrast between, I think, some of the tone that you described in the early days. Some of that was informed by a lot of the precursor work that had taken place. I mean, I trained as a lawyer originally, never practiced, but there was a dozen different reports of the Scottish Law Commission sitting on the books ready to be implemented. And many of the progressive, but still quite technocratic things that were done in the early days, things like adults with incapacity legislation, abolishing the feudal system, they were ready to go, if you like. And that was part of that. I think that went seamlessly into the culture of optimism and hope and shared endeavour that there was at the outset. We've kind of exhausted a lot of those opportunities now. So maybe that was one of the factors. But I'm going to try and put this in as non-partisan a way as I possibly can. I think since 2011, when it was the first single-party majority, the Parliament and the Scottish polity has not found a way to react in a mature way to the governing party having an ultimate ambition to change the nature of the Parliament itself and its power. And that is, I'm really trying to say that in a neutral way, without saying that they're right or wrong about that. It has added an extra element, the constitutional dimension, an extra amount of invective, I see, to a lot of the policy decisions we've been confronted with. And it means that, for example, when I was part of the coalition negotiation in 2003, when they were proffered in 2007 and never happened, part of the view that was offered was, I'm always going to have a level of suspicion about whether if a party which wants to make constitutional change is advocating for a domestic policy in order to try and advance the constitutional agenda or not. And that extra layer has been just very difficult for the parties to be able to try and adapt to and deal with. And I hope I've managed to say that in a neutral way. But I'm trying to reflect on the fact that I think that alongside all the other debates, the other factors that you've alluded to, Esther, things like social media, the tone of debate going down, that undercurrent of the constitutional element, I think, has made it more challenging. And I don't think we've reacted well as an institution to it. Thank you.
A couple of questions in there around thoughts on early decision-making around the settlement with Westminster, and budget was given as an example. Thoughts on English devolution, and you phrase that incredibly carefully, and I'm worried I'm going to paraphrase it poorly, but a reflection that since 2011, Parliament's not found a way to react, perhaps in a mature way, to solve this thinking around advancing the constitutional agenda. So who would like to kick off?
So I'll try and bring the two together. So the settlement was much sharper at the beginning. So there was a process. How long was the convention? I mean, 10 years?
It was 10 years in total, but from establishment to launching the scheme was 6 years.
So there was a process which began with very tiny roots. It was a small number of individuals who created the space which the politicians entered into. There was a detailed programme of development, which then Labour in government in the UK having to actually then implement it. So there was a sharply defined and fairly simple division between Scotland and the rest of the UK. The devolved issues were quite clear. What's happened since then is we've had a series of add-ons to the Parliament. So the most recent one being in response to the independence referendum, where there's been quite substantial additional welfare powers, quite substantial changes in the fiscal regime, the tax powers. But there hasn't been the same process of delivering those add-ons to the Parliament as happened when the Parliament was created. And I think we are well past the point of needing that sort of much more reflective, where stands the Scottish Parliament today? And it's a conversation which is just not for the politicians. Once again, it's a conversation I think would benefit by having Civic Scotland involved. So after 25 years, where do we stand? What's working, what isn't working? What additional powers might we need? What ongoing relationships do we need? What are the challenges facing Scotland over the next 10, 15, 25 years? And is the Parliament fit for purpose? So that's a conversation I wish we could have as a country. over these next couple of years.
Well, fire in. To come back to your question about the foundations, I wasn't involved heavily in the finances, but there is a report by a group called FIAG, the Financial Issues Advisory Group, and it got a lot of what it asked for. But in the end, the Scotland Act was negotiated at Westminster. I think Donald Dewar and his team did a phenomenal job and got the vast majority of what was in our scheme into the Act. But I would absolutely agree with Stephen. And one of the things we've not talked about, the Parliament over the 25 years has gained significant additional powers and responsibilities, and it's still only got 129 people. So there's an issue in there for discussion. In terms of the post-2011, and again, I will be completely neutral in the where do we go from here, but you're absolutely right. In the run-up to the 14 referendum, I was on the Press Complaints Commission in London, and I would go down and some fairly big-hitting names would say to me, oh, what's going on up there now, and is what you're going to do, and all of that. And the question I was often asked was, why do Labour and the SNP hate each other so much? And it's a really difficult question, and I think there is still, much less amongst the younger generation, thankfully, but amongst my generation, there is still a bit of tension, let's call it, between the two parties that then meant post-2014, you're absolutely right, that constitutional issue became the focus. And I'm with Stephen. Whatever you want as our ultimate destination, whether you want to stay in the UK, whether you want a reformed UK, or whether you want independence within Europe, we have to find a way to get beyond this constitutional binary. We just have to. Because right now, the country is heading for its knees, and there is a huge amount we can do with the powers we already have, and there are powers we could take. And if I come back to local government, the financial situation, if we properly empowered local councils with financial powers, there are all sorts of ways they could raise money. I still struggle that having fought for that parliament, I listen to them argue about why councils should have a tourist tax or not. Back to your point about enabling, and why should that matter to the parliament? All over Europe, councils, or very small councils, put on a tourist tax. That was not what I thought a parliament would do. Coming back to your law commission, one of my issues is when we did the CSG, we worked with the civil servants very closely to model the legislative process. We knew there was a pressure cooker of legislation having come up through the Law Commission. You'll know better than me, John, but I seem to remember something like, in the previous 10 years, there had only been 3 opportunities to debate the NHS in Scotland at Westminster. And there was all of this, stuff building up. So there definitely was that pressure cooker, and I think that has been sorted. But I keep hearing that expression, when the only tool in your box is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Actually, your tool in the box is not legislation, but we legislate for everything. And I look at a very well-intentioned bill going through right now, Liz Smith of the Conservatives, guaranteeing every young person a week's outdoor education. Very well-intentioned, and I would agree with her. But what about the arts and culture? What about all the other things? And actually, how are local councils going to deliver that? Many of them have shut their outdoor education facilities. Did we need a bit of legislation? Did we not just need to invest some money in building facilities? So I think there's absolutely that issue. And then on your English question, I often say in 79, and I wasn't all that engaged, it was a Scot representing an English constituency that put the weird thing into the referendum that meant we didn't get our parliament despite voting for it. And the northeast of England's view was, you're not having if we're not. By the time I was involved in the run-up to 97, the campaign for a Northeast Assembly was cheering us on, saying, if you get, there's a better chance we'll get. And I still don't understand, given John Prescott was so positive, how the vote in the Northeast went the way it did. But there is no doubt, and I was invited to speak at a local government association up against one of the Conservative local government ministers. Should it be an English Parliament or should it be devolved regions? And my answer was, it's up to England. It's not for us to tell you. You need to decide. But actually, Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland have all been devolved. England is the remaining bit of the jigsaw. And I think some of what we've seen this year is about England struggling with that bit of its own identity. The flippant bit of me used to say the reason nobody's engaged is because they think they've got an English Parliament, because it's been there 1,000 years and we were kind of tacked on. But I was being a bit facetious there. But I do think it's a really serious debate, and I do think Keir Starmer's government look like they're ready to address it. But I think it will be a very different model from what's here. But that bottom-up, the pressure is building everywhere for that bottom-up model.
John, any thoughts on either that kind of English question or that, to borrow a phrase from Esther, is the only tool at our disposal a hammer?
I fundamentally agree on both things. On a different take on the English question, and going back to the original settlement, I think we need some historical context here. It wasn't England that wasn't ready. When Labour swept to power in '97, despite the fact that despite the efforts, or the successful efforts of Esther and her colleagues, their manifesto said that they would legislate for a Scottish Parliament within the first year, or they were subject to the referendum. It was a matter of astonishment to most people in London that the manifesto said that. We were ready. We could see it coming, obviously, and we romanticised it, because one of the lessons from the previous referendum was that this had to be run from Scotland, not from Whitehall. So I and a colleague turned up in Whitehall on the first Monday after the election for a meeting with our Cabinet Office colleagues in what we romantically called the Dawn Raid, and said, right, this is what the manifesto says. Let's get moving. This is our plan. We'll be writing a prospectus for the referendum. You'll get to see it, and you'll get to comment on it.
What was your job at that time?
At that time, what was I? I was the head of finance and central services in the Scottish office, and the colleague I was with, because I was not the lead here, I was a bit player. The colleague I was with was Robert Gordon, who was head of the bit of the office that was preparing for devolution. But and I'll pass over the anecdote of how that commitment to write the document for the '97 referendum led to me being threatened with the sack from my role by Number 10 over where I placed a comma in the text.
Maybe that's an anecdote slightly later.
Yeah, absolutely. But I wanted to come back to this point about division. Again, slightly bizarre story. I was in Australia talking to a group about a third of the size of this room in a university in Melbourne, and it was podcast. And to my complete astonishment, it was picked up in Scotland. And one of the things I'd said to that group of university people was that my fear was that the referendum would leave us permanently divided, whichever way it went. And an eminent journalist, I discovered, I've never read it, mocked me in the Glasgow Herald and said, I don't still have my '97 referendum T-shirt. Well, of course not, because we were overwhelmingly of one view in '97. But I invite you to consider how many cars you see with their yes sticker still on their rear windscreen, and reflect whether there aren't lots of signs that we find it difficult to move. And I don't think we can blame the Parliament for that. If we can't heal our collective view as a citizenry, then I think it's a lot to ask of the Parliament to do it for us, and rather contrary to the general thrust of what we're saying.
Thank you. So, next question.
Thank you. Does this work?
It does.
Excellent. So I'm David Rogers. I think I'm still recovering from my bit part in the year that followed the John's Dawn raid. So I've got a question about whether you think any of the conditions that are currently in place, which I think are obstacles to anything approaching a new politics of the sort that was envisaged, could be removed. So having in mind two sets of issues. The first is the point that shared power, I think, needs engagement, as we've talked about, and it needs engagement with the people as well as just Civic Scotland. And I would contend there's a significant difference between those two groups. It also needs shared responsibility and shared accountability, so that on things like educational performance, that's a shared responsibility. Government, has some role, but so does local government. All the parties have been involved in some ways, but the mud tends to stick to the governing party. It needs a mature discourse, a media that treats things seriously rather than just reporting people's criticisms of each other and other people's responses. Now, I don't think any of those conditions are in place in Scotland at the moment. The incentives are all for it to be the bear pit that you've described. That was even the case during COVID, which was quite a formative experience for anyone working in or close to government, I think. Scotland did relatively well, as did Wales, in its management of the pandemic relative to England, the chaotic decision-making there. But normal politics weren't suspended here. There was opposition, and there should have been, but there was a lot of vilification going on. And I don't think that was good for the public discourse, to the extent that measures been taken here, by the SNP government, identical to those in Wales by a Labour government, heavily criticised by Labour here, and so on. Now, it's a two-way process. I'm reflecting the position of somebody working in government. Second set of issues is around whether the public care or not. Now, what we've seen since 2018 in particular is an erosion of the Scottish Parliament's powers. That the measures that were in place, like the Sewell Convention, and to try and protect the Parliament, have been breached, and the public don't care. We've seen bypassing of the Scottish Parliament on spending, and it appears the Labour government's intending on doing that because that's what the political incentives are. So, do you think that anything could change to give us a situation where people would care about the institution and about the way the politics are done with it, within it, and around it?
Take the easy one first. I was delighted to see, for all my reservations about the new government, that one of Keir Starmer's first acts was to get on his bike and come to Edinburgh and Cardiff and Belfast, and I thought that was a great sign. However, if there is truth in the rumour that the Scotland office is going to become a spending department, then that's a very different signal. Not least of which that when we created the Parliament, there was a suggestion that there was no need anymore for a Secretary of State for Scotland or for Wales or for Northern Ireland, and that we could have some kind of weird, Secretary of State for the Constitution or whatever. So the notion that the Scotland office can become a spending department and spend money on issues, especially when it's being framed, and I'm going to make this point in a minute, as because the SNP government have been incompetent. Now, we only have the media version of that. I don't know if anybody's ever actually said that. And I think you've hit on a point that's really important about the media. And Brian Taylor was very frank last week about the role of the media. And again, it's easy to apologise for them because, of course, our newspapers have had their staffing slashed. They don't have the luxury that Brian Taylor and the political gang had when I was in the convention. I'd open the doors in the Cosla building and this pack of guys, and they were all guys, were sitting outside and had been there all morning waiting for it. So they're in a hurry and they don't have a resource. So they do write the he said, she said kind of story rather than do the kind of investigative journalism that would help. So I do think the media have a role, and I don't know how we fix that, but I believe, again, citizen journalism is growing and we're getting much more. And I suspect, looking at the young women in the front row here, they're much more likely to be looking at that kind of stuff than they are to be reading the Herald or the Scotsman or the Dundee Courier. How do we get back to that discourse, given how difficult things are? I do think we, the people, have to accept that responsibility. And again, I'll not labour the point. People don't care because they feel powerless and they just see it as a bear pit. If we gave people power, they would accept that responsibility. And I say that as if it's not happening. In something that will be published quite soon, I talk about things like the Isle of Egg buyout, the Galgale Trust, the Govan Hill Baths. I went on holiday to Shetland this year for the first time, and I stayed in a wee community called Bigton with 300 people. They run their community shop, they run a community hall, which makes a lot of money out of the TV crew, I have to tell you, and they've now just bought the local church and run a Bigton collective that's providing support for mental health through arts and culture. 300 people. And they're doing that despite Shetland Islands Council, not with help from, not to criticise Shetland, because that's the same across the country. The Isle of Egg are running the Isle of Egg like they were a council. The people that do it are on their knees because they've got jobs and families and they're doing this as volunteers. But what a success story that's been. So there's lots of that happening. And if that could spread and the politicians could engage, then I think people would begin to care. And I think then we might begin to challenge our culture at a political level. I think that's a bit of a rant, but...
So I'll answer from a different space. 2 points. One is look to America and, what is it, the vibe shift, as it's talked about, and how in a matter of weeks the mood has shifted. So it's possible for the mood to shift. I spoke about the contrast between a politics of threat and a politics of love. So we have gone through a pretty rough 7 years. I mean, if you think about the crises we've faced, Brexit, COVID, cost of living, a war in Europe. So we are feeling fragile, we're feeling anxious, we're feeling under threat. And when we're in that space of threat, we respond in a very black and white way. So I was speaking to Pat Kane. Many of you will know Pat Kane or heard Pat Kane, and Pat offers a really interesting image of the shift between winter and spring. And there's a movement. We have our winter and things die and there's darkness, but spring follows winter. And I think the challenge for us is to be facilitators of that move from the long winter we've just had, in all the ways that we've had it, into a new spring. So I believe it is possible for us to have the shift, but it will only happen if we actually make it happen.
I've scribbled that one down too. It's really quotable.
Yeah, you said it last week and I forgot to write it down.
Facilitating the move from winter to spring.
Go look up Pat Kane and the advantage.
John,
it's
did
brilliant.
you want to come in on any of those points around obstacles to a new politics, whether that's the need for a more mature discourse or around shared responsibility or accountability? And I do notice that's the second time that word mature has been used in a question this evening.
Yeah. And I think the first thing I'd say is mature is a big ask 25 years into a major constitutional change. I think we're unfair in our expectations of people who've struggled with a lot of change, both with close at hand, but also, as Stephen's just said, with the range of external events, COVID included, that people have had to ride over the past period. So I think it's unfair of us to think that there hasn't been enough learning time. I'm on the side of the optimists. I am absolutely convinced that we can find our way back. I put in another plug for this. One of the things we used to say about this is it's a game anybody can play. It's not a statement about what government will do. It's a statement of what we can all make a contribution to. And I think a bit of rediscovery of that will help us. And I'll go back to my point about relearning the value of international comparisons as a way of giving us confidence that if we set off in some new directions, we will achieve. If other people can achieve it, then so can we.
So you've got a question at the front.
Yeah, hello, my name's John Edward, and I actually started working in Scotland House in Brussels before the Parliament was set up, and now work, which shows that that existed before devolution, but I now work for a Council of Global Affairs that probably couldn't have existed without devolution. So the change does come, and I've been reflecting on, I sat on Ken McIntosh's review 5 years ago, and cross-party groups didn't really come up once. So there was no sense by that stage that that might be an alternative to Donald and Debbie's days back in the Civic Forum. But my question was more about, is the Parliament lonely? Is it rather in a space that it never expected it was going to be? Now, my obvious comparison for that is Europe. If you read, I remember being in Switzerland or somewhere trying to find out what was in the white paper, but there was always the expectation that the Parliament and the executive/government would in some way reflect European duties, devolved powers, agriculture, fisheries, whatever else. You also had a level of representation. We used to chair meetings in the European Parliament of the MEPs, the Committee of the Regions, Economic and Social Committee, MSPs, MPs, and so on and so forth. So there was a natural role there where devolution met the outside world, exactly that level of comparison you're talking about, as indeed it was compared with other parliaments before it was set up. And that's gone, by accident or design, but that's gone. And it's not the only isolating factor. Local government, as everyone has said, hasn't changed. The form of voting hasn't changed, but it's clear that we're still immature about what coalitions mean, because every time any party speaks to another party in local government after the elections, everybody gets indignant and says, how dare they speak to the party over the other side of the room? So we're still not there. So it's not getting that interaction with local government. There isn't the civic world that I think people thought. There isn't that natural read across to either Europe or indeed, I mean, the Northern Ireland Assembly has sat half the time of devolution, perhaps. Wales has taken its own course, not least on Brexit. And the chaos in Westminster, but also the fact that you haven't had, since 2007, similar governments means there's been this kind of separation, which I think perhaps people didn't expect. And just to add the last bit into that, there's not really even been the grist in the mill of independence. At the event, as I was talking about last week, Dennis Canavan and Margaret MacDonald were referenced a lot as independents, but they were independents because their party threw them out. The only real independent I can think of in 6 terms of Parliament is Dr. Jean Turner, who we forget. So is it just a lonely place, and we need to help it connect more for it to be more effective?
You've already spoken about. Thank you. John, you've already spoken about the value of international comparison. So your thoughts on whether we have a lonely Parliament?
I think that's true. I think we have withdrawn into ourselves a lot more. We're not, I think, active. For a while in devolution, we were out there in various European settings in a way that, as far as I know, we aren't. We don't go to European gatherings of devolved administrations anymore. So we've lost that dialogue, and even within the UK, we started off thinking, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, all in pretty much the same boat, different models, but basically the same concept, and there was intensive engagement. And whilst that hasn't disappeared, I think, what do I know? It's a long time since I was involved. My sense, looking from the outside, is that the frequency and intensity of that has diminished. Now, maybe that's not our doing. With Northern Ireland not there half of the time, perhaps that was a hard thing to hold together. So I think we've made ourselves lonelier in various ways, and maybe we need to take a lead in some reinvigoration of some of those dialogues. Nothing stops us, inviting others to our party.
So I spoke about the idea of the strong participation. So those who were arguing most for the strong participation were deeply connected with what was going on in Europe. So there was a real sense for many who were involved in the convention, and you can talk about this as well, influenced by the events that were happening behind the Iron Curtain, the movements of democracy, really quite intense connections between people in Scotland and people elsewhere in Europe. And so the Scottish Parliament being seen as being part of that wider movement of events, democratisation in Europe. I think that connection has gone. So I like the phrase, is the Parliament lonely? I like the question, is the Parliament lonely? What's in my mind is the Parliament is somehow disembodied. So the Parliament still doesn't feel as though it has connected with the body politic I talked about earlier on in the way that it could. So for me, there's a task to connect, and I think once the head is better connected to the body, that will then allow us to once again, I think, be a wee bit more outward looking, and maybe even consider putting on a new head yet again with independence. But there's a task, I think, which is that disembodiment, disconnection that I certainly feel there is, and it's not in every respect. I mean, it's not to exaggerate, but it just doesn't quite feel as though the two are fitting together.
That's going to be one of the powerful takeaways for me, John, that image of the Parliament as lonely. And if I can flip it for a moment and go back to the days of the convention, one of the things that I loved about what we were doing was that Scotland was becoming a shining example of democracy. And I mentioned last week, I think, that when we launched the convention scheme in 95, and then again the night of the referendum, when Neil Mackintosh was doing the count in the ICC, there were TV crews and journalists from all over the world came to see what we were doing in Scotland. And we were seen, especially given, as you say, what was going on in the Eastern European countries. And when I look back, and this one came to me very emotionally because I had not made the connection. I worked with Elizabeth Smith and the John Smith, and I get the wrong one, is it the Trust, I think? So I worked with people from Georgia and from various other Eastern European countries that wanted to learn what we'd done to get us where we'd got to. The bit that makes me emotional is that I was invited through a very obscure route to be part of a delegation that went to mark the Treaty of Yalta's 65th anniversary in Crimea, because the Crimean government wanted to talk to us about the journey we'd been on. Now, we all know where that's gone, so that's really sad. I'm not sure we have cut ourselves off. I do think that the real pity for me was that there was a great hope that the British Isles Council, or whatever it was going to be called, would bring together Wales, Northern Ireland and Scotland with Westminster so that the three devolved institutions could work together. And there's no doubt the Northern Ireland situation didn't help. But part of it goes back to, and I remember George Reid saying this, your point about Whitehall. They really weren't interested. Business as usual at Westminster. Let these three devolved things get on with what they're doing. So I think there was something missed there. And I would like to think our longer term journey, wherever it takes us, we'd begin to re-engage with those two other institutions as a minimum. I do think we need to engage more widely internationally. Campbell Christie and others were on the Committee of the Regions. It's why the convention scheme includes the commitment to the European Charter of Self-Government. Brexit has thrown all of that up. But actually there is another issue, and that was the one of the Conservative government telling Scottish politicians they couldn't meet with foreign governments without, the Foreign Office just a nonsense. We, even before we had a parliament, had offices, as you say, all over the world, through the SDA and Scottish Enterprise, through Scotland House in Brussels, all of these things. So I do think government and the presiding officer's team still do a lot of that. I don't think the parliamentarians maybe get the chance to be exposed as much to that as they might.
Esther, I'm going to interrupt you because I'm very conscious of time. And we could go on a lot longer quite happily, but we don't have the luxury of doing so, not this time anyway. So I wanted to come to each of you in turn for a very quick last thought. And if we start with John, Esther, and we'll finish with you, Stephen, and we'll do it in that order.
Okay. I'm challenged by that. I feel I've kind of, I feel I've got rid of all my thoughts largely. But I mean, I think my point is to come back to what I think is a shared sense that this is not a time for pessimism. That if we look back, we can find plenty of foundations for believing that whatever it is we didn't fulfil, we've created enough of a foundation to continue making progress if we have the will to do that.
Forgotten wisdom. Well, hopefully people will leave tonight having learned some of it or remembered some of it. And I think there's lots to learn from, but I'm with Joan. I am eternally optimistic. I don't think 25 is all that old yet in the scheme of things. And I'm really hopeful for the future.
And Stephen?
So I think the emotion of this is quite important. The idea I like about the Parliament as a project was it was an expanding circle of inclusion. You could be in the convention, then you were in the referendum, then you were in the launch of the Parliament. You'd be able to connect to the Parliament, engage in the project in a powerful way. So I think the project we have now is to find ways to again build expanding circles of inclusion in Scotland, and that would be quite a good next step.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all three of you. I've certainly learned a lot. And I hope everyone else has too. And I think for me, my takeaway is that lovely, quite beautiful analogy actually about being in the winter and kind of the need for collective commitment and effort to see us into a spring. And I will just hand over to Susan Murray, Director of the David Hume Institute, who's done so very, very much to organise us all and bring us together this evening.
Thanks, Ellie. It's just left for me to do a few thank yous. Thank you to the panel. It's been really insightful, and to Ellie for excellent chairing, and to Whipper for your wonderful partnership. It's been brilliant working with you, and not least to Patrick for hosting us tonight. Shepherd and Wedderburn is a beautiful venue, and we are honoured that you've shared it with us tonight. Please do join us for a drink afterwards. They've been very quiet tonight, but we do have former politicians, local government and Scottish Parliament in the room. So please do ask them any questions you didn't get to. I'm afraid we couldn't get through all the questions. I too love the idea of emerging into spring. I think there's lots of knowledge that we can learn from, and we will be taking the Forgotten Wisdom series forward. Hopefully, I'm thinking with Whipper again, because it does mean that we're passing knowledge to a different generation, because lots of your members are younger. I do like John's question about international perspectives. We have Baroness Ashton visiting us in Edinburgh next week, so anyone that's not down to come, please do speak to me afterwards, because we can squeeze you in. She is a wealth of knowledge from all sorts of negotiations around the world, and is just so humble in all the diplomacy she's done, but she's been at every table where anything major has happened. I just could sit and listen to her all day. But hopefully we've planted a few bulbs tonight that can emerge in the spring, and we can take that knowledge forward and really use that as we go forward in whatever walk of life we're in. So thank you ever so much, and thank you to everyone that made tonight possible.